Okay, good afternoon, everyone joining on the East Coast, and good evening to everyone joining from West Africa. Really excited to kick off the new term with the DSA International Committee with our panel on the situation in Niger. I want to get started by just giving everyone a heads up that this call is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube. Additionally, we'll be taking questions throughout the panel. So even though our panelists will be speaking, once we get through all three, we'll sort of address audience questions. You can either type them in the chat and we'll record them, or you can raise the hand and speak at the appropriate time. Then can we get the next slide? Yes, so today we're just going to be overviewing sort of the recent events that have happened in Niger since August. There was a military coup. And we're sort of using the expertise of our three panelists to discuss neocolonialism in the Sahel region, French imperialism in West Africa, as well as the political economy of the situation to get a deeper understanding of what's transpiring, as well as the role of France, the United States, and NATO in the events in Africa, and hopefully being able to sort of uncover what we can sort of do about this, and as socialists, how we should be engaging with West Africa. After we hear our three panelists, then we'll move into the Q&A section. I'll be talking about some resources we have, and then we'll get any closing remarks or statements from the panelists. So first, I want to introduce Benga Komolafe. Benga is a Nigerian human rights activist and trade unionist. He served as the president of the National Association of Nigerian Students, which opposed the military dictatorship in Nigeria in the 1980s and 90s. In 1991, he graduated from the University of Ibadan, and along with others, founded the Committee for Defense of Human Rights. Benga also served as the Assistant General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress of Nigeria from 1997 to 2010. Currently, he's the General Secretary of the Federation of Informal Workers Organizations in Nigeria, FIWON, in fulfillment of his long-standing passion to help organize workers in the informal sectors of the Nigerian economy. And with that, I think we can start. Oh, actually, before we start, I want to introduce myself. I'm Craig. I'm the incoming co-chair of the Middle East and Africa Subcommittee within the IC. I'm joined today by Matt Almonte. We're really excited to have this as sort of our first event. And we're really looking forward to working with you all and putting on a lot of other political education events throughout the term. And so with that, we can get started with Benga.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's quite a challenge for me actually to start the discussion about what's going on in the Niger Republic because as we speak, a lot of working people in Niger Republic are actually going through very difficult times, especially in view of the sanctions that have been imposed by ECOWAS and the cutoff of electricity supply to Niger in the wake of the July 26 military coup in that country. Working people were mostly self-employed, working people in the informal sector in Niger are bearing the whole weight of these sanctions. Trade and other artisanal activities, which employs over 85% of the working population, has seriously slowed down. Livelihoods have become even more precarious than it ever was. And of course, we all know that even in the best of times, Nigerians barely manage to survive the harsh reality of the precarity of socio-economic situation in that country. inflation has stepped up by as much as 120 to 300% all over the country. And this has actually rendered a lot of working families into very helpless situations. And it's also important to highlight the fact that this situation is not limited to Niger Republic. It's also a situation that is shared by other African countries that share borders with Niger. And of course, we know there is enormous amount of cross-border, informal cross-border trade between these neighboring countries and Niger Republic. For Nigeria, in Nigeria, for instance, we have the Sahelian states of Sokoto, Borno, Kano, Jigawa, and a few other states that share direct borders with Niger Republic. We have a situation where our people in these states also have a very bad patch of the situation because they can't trade with across the border with Nigerians. As it were, although we don't have official statistics, it is very clear that enormous amounts of money have been lost by these working families. Local economies have been terribly impacted. Livelihoods have been cut short. And of course, the extremely precarious situation under which people have had to live and work in Niger and these neighboring communities around West Africa have also been terribly impacted. So we actually will start by calling on all progressive forces across the world, trade unions and social movements to prevail on ECOWAS, the Nigerian government, to actually lift these crippling sanctions on Niger Republic, while the issues thrown up by the coup are actually addressed. Because in all of this, the issues that led to the coup d'etat in Niger Republic has not even been addressed by ECOWAS. The fact that Niger Republic, as well as other, especially other Francophone African Sahelian countries, have been faced with very crippling socioeconomic conditions in the past 2 to 3 decades. And this situation has been aggravated actually with the violent overthrow of the Muammar Gaddafi regime in Libya, which has provided opportunities for extreme Islamist organizations to flourish across West Africa. We've had a situation where the Libyan small arms, have actually have been harming these extremists who have unleashed mayhem in communities across the Francophone West Africa. And this situation has not been helped by the fact that both French and the US are pouring in arms and military bases into these countries. What it does actually is that it further lends to the fractious political situation in these countries. We have a situation where actually some of these violent groups have been directly harmed by France to cause political and social destabilization. France particularly has spent billions of dollars sustaining its military bases in Niger, in Mali before it was kicked out of Mali, and in Burkina Faso before France was kicked out of that country as well. All of these countries are French bases where a lot of money is poured in, not to assist these countries to cope with the dire situations that French colonialism had imposed on these countries historically, but actually to further militarize the region and accentuate the precarity of life and society in these various Francophone countries. In Niger, particularly, the presence of the US drone base in the Agadez region and the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent in that area has also only further aggravated the dire security situation. And it's no wonder at all that local populations are rising up in uproarious protest to actually demand that France, the US, and other foreign military interests should leave the Niger. And indeed, we've seen the same sentiment expressed across the entire West Africa, French West Africa. We've had this same sentiment expressed in Senegal, particularly in 2020. We've had the same sentiments expressed in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, and so on and so forth. And it's within that context, actually, that we can situate the coup, the recent coup in Niger Republic, which is following similar pattern across the region. Since the military seems to be about the only similar cohesive social force in these regions, it's no surprise that it's the military that is coming out to actually put some concrete action to the frustration of the general populace with the dire economic and social situation that they have to live under. In Niger Republic, we have a situation where France has mined the uranium in Niger and partly use it to actually supply its own electricity in France, and paying little, next to nothing for this uranium, while the local population live largely in darkness because of absence of electricity. And not only this, we have also had a situation where the terrible environmental impact of this exploitation, of crude exploitation of uranium, which we all know is highly very radioactive, has led very large swaths of land extremely polluted. People are getting crippled as a result of uranium-induced, radioactive effects, which have been proven to have serious effect on the bones. A lot of people who are getting blinded. So it's no surprise that the locals are coming out to say enough of this. France should leave because there has been absolutely nothing to show for the exploitation of uranium in Niger. The little that comes in has been likely shared by the few elite interests among the political class. So I will want to end my initial comments by saying that indeed the events in Niger and other Francophone African countries offers yet another opportunity for anti-imperialist forces all over the world, particularly all over Africa and the African diaspora, as well as other progressive social movements, to lend voice, to join voices with the Nigerian, the cry of the Nigerian people for France to leave that country alone, to evacuate its forces, and for Niger to be able to actually determine how best to exploit its own natural resources and how best to make use of those resources for the betterment of people. And of course, we will not end that plea by us without also calling on Nigerians to be vigilant at this time. That of course, military coup historically has proven not to be an answer to the issue of development and democratization in Africa. Military coup very often has become part of the problem, actually, to foster genuine democracy that empowers people to take charge of their life and to determine how they will be governed. Military coup has been a hindrance rather than a help to achieve genuine democratization. So we want to also call on Nigerians and all Africans to be vigilant, to make the right kind of demands on the military in Niger. That yes, they seem to be taking the right steps right now. They seem to be making the right demands out of Western imperialist interest right now, but they should go further than that to ensuring that they are actually able to canalize all energies and opportunities. They are able to reach out, reach the kind of political international alliances that will enable them to fight foreign-sponsored militarism and violent Islamism, as well as empower local people to actually take charge of their own life. I think I will stop for now. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, Benga, for your analysis. You touched on some really complex issues that I hope we can, get to explore throughout the rest of the panel. So now we can move on to our next panelist. Our next guest here is Dr. Ndongo Samba Silla. Dr. Silla is a Senegalese development economist. He's currently employed by the International Development Economics Associates as the researcher and policy director for Africa. He authored the book, The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich, and co-authored Africa's Last Colonial Currency, the CFA franc story. He's also a co-editor of Economic and Monetary Sovereignty for the 21st century, or for 21st century Africa, and editor of Imperialism and the Political Economy of Global Southeast Debt, and he tweets it at @Silla. Dr. Silla, I guess you can get started.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here among all of you and to have the chance to talk about a very important and timely topic. So I would like to thank Mira among the organizers, and also I saw that some comrades are also attending, like Baba Aye and Corina Molin. So I will make some points about what is going on in Niger and generally in Francophone Africa. The first point is that we have to be careful with the idea that there's a return of coups in Africa. This is a view that we find in some media, I would say most mainstream media. This view is false. There is not a return of coups in Africa. Because Africa is a continent of 55 countries, according to the African Union. And these coups have been happening, especially in Francophone Africa, if you accept for Sudan, at least since 2020. Generally, when it is about Africa, people just generalize and they do never specify the reality, in fact, what is going on. We have to say that in Africa, after the Cold War, let's say from the 2000s, for most of the African countries, the coups, military coups disappeared. That means there have been sometimes coup attempts, but they failed. For most of the African countries, coup d'etats are now a thing of the past, most of them. And the thing is, since the independences, 1960s, there have been 16 countries which never observed a successful coup. There have been some attempts in those 16 countries, but they failed. So this is also something to be said, because people generally love to generalize about Africa as if, everything that is not good, you would find it in Africa. And I had also to say that coups are something that are statistically normal, in the sense that in Africa, we inherited borders drawn in the 19th century during the Berlin Conference. Most African countries did not inherit democratic institutions from the time of independence, because colonialism in itself was not providing these democratic institutions. In the case of Francophone Africa, the institutions were authoritarian, despotic, in the sense that all the powers were concentrated in the hands of the colonial governor. So we inherited those structures. And when you factor in the Cold War dynamics, that means every time Western powers could intervene to oust the rulers they do not like, or to try to consolidate, rulers that are on their side. So when you take all of this into account, it is statistically normal that you find coup d'etats. And if you look at history, for example, the history of Latin America, you will see that most of these countries, they got their independence in the 19th century. But for more than a century, every year you could see military coups in Argentina, in Peru, or in Brazil, etc. So that means that when it comes to coups, African countries have been performing historically very, very well, if you take into account all of this. I'm not saying that coups are a good thing. I just try to historicize. And the other thing is that even in countries where there have been no military coups, generally they have not been democratic. But this is something to be said in order, to get rid of all of these cliches about Africa. And the thing is, all of these coups now happen in Francophone Africa. Until the latest coup in Gabon, they happened in the Sahel Band, with coups in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Chad also, in Niger. And all of these countries are Francophone countries. And if you accept Guinea, all of these countries, they use the CFA franc, which is a colonial currency born in 1945. And when you look at the statistics, you will see that CFA franc countries have been generally confronted with coup d'etats far more than the other countries of the continent. So these CFA franc countries, they have been impoverished because they use this colonial currency, which was not meant for their development, but to allow for the extraction of the resources to France and to other parts of the world. So when you use the CFA franc, that means that you have no possibility of development. And you could also see that when you look at the evolution of the real GDP per capita of all of these countries. The richest country in the CFA franc zone is Cote d'Ivoire. And yet Cote d'Ivoire in 2020 had a real GDP per capita that was something like 24% lower than its best level of real GDP per capita of real income it achieved in 1978. If you take Niger, their best level of real income per capita was achieved in 1965. And now you see that the real income is 59% lower than this best level they achieved in 1965. If you take the case of Gabon, all the media say this is one of the richest countries in terms of per capita income. That's true. But the thing is their real income declined by 50% since 1976. So all of these countries, they have declined economically or at best stagnated, all these countries using the CFA franc. The other thing to say also is the militarization of the Sahel, because when you militarize zone, you have to expect having more military governments. And the militarization of the Sahel started with the NATO and also the French, US, UK invasion and destruction of Libya. What is happening in the Sahel would not have happened without, the illegal intervention, destructive intervention of, the joint imperialism of the US, UK, France, and NATO. So whenever people talk about the Sahel, we should remind this fact. And when you militarize a zone, you have military coups and you have also military governments. Now, it's not only in Francophone Africa. You have military government in Sudan, you have military government in Libya, you have military government in Egypt. And when you look at Mauritania, their current president is a military people, but he came to power through elections because he has been successful in his, policy against containing the jihadist threat. So when you militarize a zone, you will have military government. And this is something to be repeated because every time you have these military coups, their first reflex is to say that we have to intervene military to stop that. Intervening military will not stop that. And the other thing to be said about these coups is that they are one aspect of the democratic crisis in Francophone Africa. Because there are countries in Francophone Africa that are considered as democracies, like, for example, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, etc. Well, they could be considered democracies in the standard liberal languages, but in fact, in these countries, you will see harsh political repression of the opposition, of the dissidents, and of ordinary demonstrators. And this political violence is also compounded by economic violence. That means you could have nice rates of economic growth, 6% GDP growth, for example, in Senegal since 2012 to the 2019. But you see that this economic growth does not benefit the poorest, does not benefit the majority because it's extractive. And it is mostly based on increasing their indebtedness in foreign currency. So the most eloquent illustration of this economic violence is a number of people dying every day, young people trying to join Europe through the Mediterranean or through the Sahel. You see that. So that means that in these countries, more and more, there are no perspective for the young people. There is a category called the need neither in employment, education, or in training. If you look at Niger and all the countries of the Sahel, most of their young people are in this category need. That means that they have no perspective at all. So the reason these schools happen in these countries is that because you have no economic development and also you have no institutional autonomous development, because obviously you have other countries which are not democratic, but at least their states have some currents in the sense that they manage autonomously throughout the decades to build some states that are resilient towards coup attempts. And this has not been the case in Francophone Africa. And this is also not a surprise because if you want to understand what is happening here, currently, we have to know the story of Francophone Africa after the Second World War to the independence period. Because what happened at that time is that the colonial administrations made sure that the progressive forces would never come to power through normal elections. By progressive forces, I could identify three kinds of progressive forces. You have the nationalist, you have the Pan-Africanist, and you have the communist. And during this period, everything has been done to prevent these forces to win elections. And when, for example, in the case of Cameroon, you have a very structured, very organized party, an independentist party like the UPC, Union des Populations du Cameroun, what was done is to dissolve this party and to kill their leaders. So that at the start of independence, the 1960s, most of the leaders in Francophone Africa, if you accept Sékou Touré and Togo, which was a former German colony, most of them did not want independence. And those who wanted independence were marginalized or killed. So that means that it had been very difficult for progressive forces to come to power through normal elections. After the independencies, you have the single party regime. So the only way to disrupt this regime had been through military coups. And after the end of the single party regimes with the so-called democratization, the things did not change because the single party regimes and also the Cold War period have been a period to destroy the progressive forces. And now that means that this democracy does not have any social content at all because you don't have any alternative. These democracies are like Tandika Makandabwe used to say, choiceless democracies. And that's why you would understand that if you take a look at all the rulers of Francophone Africa, in fact, I made a database, all the readers who ruled Francophone Africa, the countries of Francophone Africa, even for one day. If you look at them in the post-independence period, you will see that the few progressive forces that came to power generally came from the military, like, for example, Thomas Sankara, like Marian Gwabi, etc. I am not saying that the military is by nature progressive, but due to the colonial legacy, the thing is that every time you had a kind of nationalist government or progressive government, it had come through the military, because these regimes are not progressive, and this regime also do not allow young people. When I say young people, I mean people less than 50 years, allow these people to come to power through normal elections. And you could see that also in Senegal with the case of Ousmane Sonko. So in the 1960s, if you had something like 40 years, you could have access to power. Now, if you exclude the military, you have to have at least, on average, 60 years to come to power. And you will see that, for example, in the case of Mali, in the case of Guinea, in the case of also Burkina Faso, it's the young military people who overthrew, elected president who were aged something like 70 and beyond. So that means that the young people want leaders who are like them, but normally you don't have this kind of result through the electoral process. So this also has to be factored in. The other point I would like to say is that we have a kind of also conflicts between the forms of legitimacy, because for the Western liberal rhetoric, the only legitimate government is so-called representative liberal government. And the form of legitimacy they tend to valorize is the legitimacy in accessing power through elections. But the thing is, there are other forms of legitimacy that also could be seen in the debates. For example, there is a legitimacy in exercising power. Most of these governments that had been overthrown, when they were on power despite being elected, often through fraudulent means, they did not respect the law. They did not respect the constitution. Sometimes they wanted to have a third illegal term, etc. This has been the case in Guinea, for example. And after that, the government was overthrown. We saw it recently in Gabon, because Ali Bongo wanted to cheat the elections, and he had been overthrown also by the military. So these people, generally, they might be elected through fraudulent means, but they generally do not respect their constitution. The other thing is also the people tend to base democratic legitimacy, political legitimacy, in terms of the socioeconomic performance delivered by the system. For example, in most of these countries called democracy, there is these countries are, following neoliberal policies, and they do not, create, the economic performance, wanted by their people. And the last form of legitimacy is the diplomatic legitimacy. That means that there are countries which are not legitimate in terms of accessing to power. I mean, rulers who are not legitimate in terms of their accessing to power, in terms of accessing power, and in terms also of the socioeconomic performance. We could give the example of Chad. The current government in Chad was unconstitutional in the sense that the former ruler was killed, and his son succeeded him through unconstitutional ways. So this has been a coup. But this coup was backed by France, and no one is talking about Chad. Everyone is talking about Niger. Now, with a coup in Gabon, which is not threatening French interests, the Gabonese government, they are called the new authorities. While in Niger, the discourse is to say this is a junta. So you could see the double standards. So that means depending on whether you are pro-West or pro-France, the discourse will change. And that means that when you see that some of these coups are popular, it's because the populations, they see that these rulers have not been delivering on their expectations. So the last point is to say that these countries, they need strong reforms. I would even say democratic revolution in a good sense of the term. That means these people should do themselves their own constitutions. Otherwise, it will be battle between the civil oligarchies, and at one point the military will intervene. That means people should themselves do their constitutions, but they should not do their constitutions in the way they did it in the 1990s, because this was constitutional reforms done, under the aegis of the international financial institutions. So that means that they should have a kind of constitutionalism which has strong social content, how to change economic relations, and how also to have political system that could generate meaningful progress for the people. And getting rid of the CFA franc for all these countries in the Sahel, in Central Africa, West Africa, is really important. And what is also important is that all these countries should try, to frame their economy in a way that leads to the implementation of policies that will help them achieve basic rights to food, to health, to employment, etc. All of this is possible because these countries are not poor, and they could achieve that. And last but not least, we have to oppose war, all of us, because war is never the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Silla. That was an excellent analysis, and I can't wait to have the questions come into the chat, engage more with what you said. Now we finally want to get to our last guest. If we can get the next slide. Tunde Ostazua from the Black Alliance for Peace. Tunde is a member of Black Alliance for Peace's Africa team and the former coordinator of BAP's US Out of Africa Network, which is made up of activists and organizers committed to strategizing around creative and radical tactics with the complete withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Africa, the demilitarization of the African continent, and the closure of US military bases throughout the world. The USOAN is the driving force of the Shutdown AFRICOM campaign of the Black Alliance for Peace. And Tunde is also the outreach coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace and a member of BAP's coordinating committee. So thank you for joining us, Tunde, and I can't wait for you to sort of tie a lot of these things together that the previous two guests were discussing. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and thank you to the DSA International Committee for organizing this webinar and inviting me. The people's movements in Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Gabon, and more broadly, West Africa and Central Africa are crucially important. So I'm honored to be on this panel to discuss these important developments with everyone here. So BAP, the Black Alliance for Peace, seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement. So we work to oppose both militarized domestic state repression and the policies of destabilization, subversion, and the permanent war agenda of the US state globally. BAP stands with the democratic will of the masses, and we oppose any military intervention by any force backed by the West, including ECOWAS. And we think anyone should feel comfortable taking that position and also getting involved with these types of struggles. So we call this ECOWAS intervention threat imperialism and blackface, right? They are using this African military force to carry out the dictates and interests of imperialist forces. We see similar things with the threat of Kenya and CARICOM, right? The Caribbean community of states intervening in Haiti. We see that also as an example of imperialism and blackface. And to bring it to where I am here in Atlanta, Cop City in Atlanta is being pushed by Black politicians like the Atlanta mayor, Andre Dickens. It's just another example, right? But to us, right, military coups in and of themselves aren't the problem. It's what's behind them, the people's interests or interests that aren't the people's interests. So we assess coups as the same way as we do forces within an armed struggle situation. So there are situations where legitimate interests or forces really have no option other than armed struggle. And the same goes for coups. A coup could be a good thing depending on what the alternative is. So let's say the alternative is the continuation of neocolonialism, then a coup might be in the interest of the masses, in the interest of the people. And I'll also say quickly that, we can't fall into the tendency to define things the same way that the West does, right? So, for example, how we define democracy or a country as a democracy, because like by Western standards, the US and capitalist countries are democracies, but Cuba isn't. And I think we have to, have a more sophisticated analysis than that. Like we saw with that recent family code, the most progressive family code that there is, essentially, that Cuba just passed, and the processes for feedback and for input from the Cuban population really demonstrate the democratic nature of the Cuban state. So just to, reel it back in, we see West Africa as, being in turmoil, right? What we in the Black Lines for Peace would call a crisis of imperialism. We would trace that turmoil back to 600 years of history, including the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent colonialism and today's neocolonialism. An important event to call out is the Berlin Conference, during which representatives of 13 European nations and the United States met in Berlin, Germany, to carve up the African continent. This meeting, the Berlin Conference, marked the intensification of the scramble for Africa. And we know that the orientation of France, the US, and NATO hasn't really changed since that Berlin Conference, on through to it conspiring to thwart the African independence movements that swept the continent in the 50s, the 1950s and 1960s, up until today. We're currently seeing a new scramble for Africa to maintain control over African land, resources, and labor on the part of the US and NATO and France and others in the West. So, from Algeria to Madagascar, France historically has been implicated in numerous assassinations, coups, and regime change operations since its former colonies gained flag independence. There are at least 22, I think, coups and assassinations of African heads of state that France has been implicated in. The US was also involved in many of these assassinations to maintain Western hegemony, including the high-profile assassinations of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Gaddafi, and many more. I would also highlight the US, NATO, France role in the destruction of Libya, right, in 2011, because it offers some important lessons. First off, we know that US imperialism and its Western lackeys don't accept any country that decides to be an independent force outside of its sphere of influence. Actually, on March 19th, 2011, AFRICOM, which is headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, launched Operation Odyssey Dawn, which was the first phase of the war to overthrow the Libyan government and destabilize the country. NATO carried out that bombing campaign over Libya, which exacted something like 26,000 sorties and nearly 10,000 airstrikes. As a result of that war against Libya, the country lost 50% of its GDP. And the IMF noted that Libya's GDP was 71.3 billion in 2010 US dollars. And then, that basically suggests that through 8 months of conflict, the country lost about $35 billion. The country's 6.5 million people lost about $35 billion. So the US, NATO-led war on Libya, I think will be remembered as one of history's greatest crimes. It also launched the process in which many of the arms or weapons that the competing armed insurgents are using to further the neo-colonial destabilization of the Sahel. That's kind of a major source of those weapons that were basically supplied by the US and France. And we see France as junior partners of the US, right? Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was explicit on how NATO moved into Africa as part of the efforts to shift colonial power from the traditional European powers to the new colonial hegemon, which is the US. So really the US, NATO, France, the European Union, it's really all kind of the same force, or one big gang, as our comrade Mbap and the AAPRP, Rafiki Morris, would say. a gang that we call the US, EU, NATO axis of domination. NATO killed Gaddafi, and NATO is also in Niger. And we're fighting, right? The people of Niger, the people of Burkina Faso, the people of Mali are fighting against a system that is unified. And so in order to defeat that system, we who are on the side of peace and against war also have to be unified. So the objective of the US, EU, NATO axis of domination is neocolonial control over Niger and the Sahel region. Niger is the last state in West Africa where a large number of Western soldiers are stationed under the US war on terror regime. The US and France claim that they're in the Sahel to secure the region against insurgent groups, but it's no secret that these groups are tools of the US, EU, NATO axis of domination that are used to destabilize countries in the Sahel region. The French, NATO, and the US created a crisis by having these so-called Islamic insurgents attack civilian populations. This is what led African client states to, invite foreign military forces into their territories to help fight violence from non-state armed groups, right? So, AFRICOM, the French, NATO, they created the problems that they claim to now be fighting. And I think we can look to France's failed Operation Barkhane as an example. It tripled the rate of violence within the region and led to the loss of so many innocent lives. So right now, there are 9 US military bases in Niger, both AFRICOM and CIA bases, according to David Vine's research and the World Beyond Wars visual database. There are, bases like the CIA facility in Dirkou and the Air Base 101 in Niamey. And, that one in Niamey, Air Base 101, has been the site of massive demonstrations calling for the removal of French military presence. There's also, a facility at the airport in Niamey, Dior Hamani International Airport, one in Arlit, Maradi, Difa, Madama, Niger Air Base 201. And all of this you can find on that World Beyond War tool. They have a tool where they, I guess, map out the various US military bases that, we have, I guess the United States has overseas. There's something like 800. So, for us, it's a question of like, why are there so many military installations in Niger, right? I think it's something like 1 in Burkina Faso, maybe 2 in Mali. And so Niger is important to the West. And we see that as, as being because, the Sahel and Niger in particular is incredibly resource rich. Niger is the world's 7th biggest uranium producer, as well as a prolific exporter of gold, minerals, oil, and coal. So France and other European Union countries rely on Niger for something like 15 to 30% of their uranium imports, which are critical to Europe's nuclear energy sector. But all this is while the majority of Niger's population doesn't even have access to electricity, right? So, as folks have already said, the vast wealth in Niger doesn't benefit the people. The wealth of Niger, like the wealth of most of the African continent, goes to the imperialist, neocolonial European Western powers that have a stranglehold on the country. The uranium stolen from Niger is used to power 1 in 3 light bulbs in France and countless numbers of French homes, while the people of Niger are unable to afford even 3 meals a day in many cases. So Niger's uranium is of such importance to France and France's nuclear powered infrastructure. The French military forces seized the city of Arlit on behalf of French multinational uranium mining corporation. And so that's just brief, but I wanted to get back into the coups and military takeovers. And really the coup in Niger, as folks have stated, kind of follows a pattern of recent takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and beyond, right? A lot of these are all basically former French colonies who replaced neocolonial regimes with military governments. Some of these governments have strong anti-imperialist sentiments, strong nationalist foundations, and some of them are working to create a federation of African states. I think we see that specifically in Burkina Faso and Mali, where they've invited other countries to join their federation In Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the masses have taken to the streets in demonstrations that have set the stage for what we see as popular coups. The distinguishing characteristic of these demonstrations is that they've been sustained over long periods of time. They're anti-imperialist and call for, in many cases, the United States of Africa. So these rebelling states unite to resist the imperialist occupation and control of the Sahel. And, they have to stay united, right, to free the Sahel of all imperialist military forces and intelligence operatives. So there have been protests also in Niger against US military presence and the US bases in Niger demanding the withdrawal of US troops, though they've been less prominent, maybe because the US has played more of a behind the scenes role since the coup. But that I think that's also important to name. So for us, we condemn the threats of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, to lead a military intervention into Niger. We think this would be an act of subservience to US, EU, NATO interests, as Western imperialism seems to be losing its neo-colonialist grip on Africa. It seems to be trying to expand its use of puppets and proxies to undermine resistance, as I mentioned earlier with the blackface imperialism, or the ways in which I guess we're seeing them utilizing these forces to act on their behalf to further their interests. But with the ever-present threat of invasion, Burkina Faso and Mali pledged to defend Niger from any foreign military intervention. Guinea-Conakry also conveyed their intent to refuse any offensive action against Niger if requested by ECOWAS. Algeria also warned against any intentions of foreign military intervention, according to a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad, right? So, we definitely commend and celebrate these statements and these declarations that these countries would defend Niger. But we also understand that, ECOWAS is working as a comparative structure along with the West African Economic and Monetary Union. So, following the military coup in Niger, ECOWAS decided to impose humiliating and illegitimate sanctions on Niger at the end of the Heads of State Conference in Abuja, Nigeria on July 30th. These sanctions quickly led to rising food prices in the country, reduced electricity supplies, inaccessibility to pharmaceutical products, difficulty in banking transactions, restrictions on the movement of goods and people, and so on, right? So this inhuman situation worsens the plight of populations already suffering from the crisis of governance experienced by our neo-colonial states, as folks have already described. So the situation in Niger demands an African response, not the imperialist-led and anti-people militarized one suggested by members of ECOWAS. ECOWAS, which has historically cloaked itself in a bulwark of African solidarity, has really betrayed the masses by claiming to act in the name of regional stability. In reality, it's acting as an instrument in the service of capitalist interests, which care nothing for the agony of the Nigerian people. These unjust sanctions aim to do nothing more than stifle resistance and protect the exploiters at the expense of the oppressed. We have to raise our voices with unshakable determination to denounce the inhuman and illegitimate sanctions imposed on Niger by the Economic Community of West African States and the Monetary Union of West African States. These have been slavishly orchestrated by the imperialist and exploitative countries that continue to bleed the African continent. So, this past May 25th marked the 60th anniversary of the formation of the Organization of African Unity, or OAU, which is now the African Union, right? Unfortunately, the African Union has become an appendage of, an agent really of Western powers. The AU's suspension of Niger and preparation of further sanctions strips away any remaining facade that masks its betrayal of its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, which was created to safeguard and consolidate the hard-won independence, as well as the sovereignty and territorial integrity of African states, and to fight neocolonialism in all its forms. So the positions of the African Union and ECOWAS echo that of, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Acting Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, suggesting that genuine democracy can exist under neocolonial domination. We reject that position. There can't be any authentic national self-determination as long as the various African mini-states remain under the hegemonic control of Western imperialism. The positions of ECOWAS and the African Union demonstrate the African comprador class serves as an effective tool for the continuation of African dependency and disunity. The AU is really taking a position in alignment with the US and French government's attempts to maintain Afrikaans presence and French and NATO presence, military presence, and drain Niger of its natural resources that the people of Niger don't even get to benefit from. It's clear that the people of Niger support a different relationship between Niger and the West that's based on respect and non-exploitation. So, I mean, our position is really grounded in the fact that we're with the people and their anti-imperialist sentiments. And we think, any other kind of position flies in the face of any claim that you're for democracy. We see a coup in like these coups is almost understandable because the people don't have much of a choice. They've experienced decades of neocolonialism, which is manifested in the control of their economies and resources, the expenditures of their countries going towards militarism, and the situation, like the violence really that they're seeing from these non-state armed groups that are caused by and work in the interests of imperialism. So if the Africans in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso and beyond, right, are to emerge from this situation with continued violence from these non-state armed groups, recruitment to these groups is finding fertile ground in the conditions that they're experiencing, the neocolonialism, the comprador class, the imperialism. And if we don't deal with that, right, like if that isn't rectified or dealt with and resources aren't given to the people, we'll never really address the root cause, the problem, right? So we, as the Black Alliance for Peace, support the masses and their just aspirations, the just aspirations of the people in the streets. We really commend the people of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Gabon, and beyond in their efforts to build democracy and kick the imperialists out. And if we're really about overthrowing these oppressive systems, we have to be for the people and contribute to an ethos that makes the leaders want to support the masses, right? I think for the most part so far, the leaders haven't broken with the masses too much and the demands coming from the people in the streets. But if the leaders do break with the masses, then I don't think the masses will support them anymore, right? The masses want change. They don't want to go backwards. So, we just express solidarity and harmony again with Niger, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Algeria. We call for the withdrawal of all US, EU, NATO military forces out of the Sahel. We oppose any intervention in Niger by ECOWAS, the African Union, or any other reactionary African military force. And we stand resolutely against the US, EU, and ECOWAS sanctions imposed upon or looming over the states of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and other African states like Zimbabwe or Eritrea. So we firmly reject all attempts at military invasion by NATO member states or the ECOWAS body. So I just want to get to wrapping up, right? So the Black Alliance for Peace hosts a yearly month of action against AFRICOM, an international month of action every October to fight back against Western militarization of the African continent, and really to demand that the U.S. Africa Command is shut down. It's a big opportunity for political education and positive action or mass action to defeat the war on African people abroad and also here in the U.S., right? So, we encourage anyone who opposes war, right, to take part in the month of action. We believe that imperialism will only be defeated through the sustained actions of the organized people throughout the world. We think that we have to build an understanding of Pan-Africanism and illuminate the interdependent geopolitical and economic interests among African or Black people in Haiti, the Americas, the African continent, and also among those people domestically colonized in the enclaves of the imperialist countries. So no to imperialism and blackface, yes to Pan-African self-determination, US out of Africa, shut down Africa.
Thank you for those remarks today. And really, I want to thank all of the panelists so far for the remarks. Now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I want to start out with an audience question. Oh, by the way, audience members, please continue to bring in those questions. We're doing pretty good on time, so please keep those coming. But I want to start out by addressing Netfa's question from earlier. Netfa typed, how do the speakers think the country should determine priorities, i.e. transition to the civilian government or embarking on a process of implementing redistribution of land and material well-being for the masses, as well as protecting that outcome, even if it means prolonging military rule. Sunday, you started to, or your statement towards the end of your remarks touched on this a little bit. There can be no democracy in Africa without, dignity for the masses, dignity for those mine workers, for the informal workers, for agricultural workers in Niger and throughout West Africa. So I want you to start out by answering that question, but then I want to go back to Dr. Sula and Benga to also answer this and sort of, lay out what is the path forward for Niger and all these West African countries economically. So go ahead, Tunde.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think the people of the Sahel of West Africa have been really leading the way in terms of making the demands and kind of laying out what they see as the path forward for their projects, for their countries. I believe that there definitely has to be dignity for the masses, right? Like the masses need, their people-centered human rights. Like they need to, be able to afford, 3 square meals a day and healthcare and education and so much more, right? And I think we've heard some pretty impressive statements from some of these leaders, and in particular, I'm thinking of the leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, and I think a lot of what he's saying is not solely from him. I think that from what I'm reading and I'm hearing from some comrades on the continent is there's a really sustained process of political education in places like Burkina Faso and Mali and beyond to really get the consciousness of the people in a place where they can make those types of demands of their leadership to really improve their conditions and push back against these imperialist forces that are impoverishing them. And so for me, I think, it's continuing to embark on that process, or continuing that process of political education and putting as much pressure as possible on these leaders so they are listening to the masses and their people, right? And speaking to their needs, because I can't tell these folks in West Africa what to do from here in Atlanta, but I can try and support, again, the just aspirations of the people in the streets. So that's how I would answer that.
Thank you. Can you go ahead, Dr. Silla?
Okay, thank you. Well, one of the first things to say is that, the conception we have of democracy comes from the US. I would say comes from Ronald Reagan. Democracy means anti-communism and anti-nationalism. That means that you have to open your economic borders. You have to accept to be exploited economically speaking. But as long as you organize elections, etc., you are called a democracy. And in Francophone Africa, people organize so-called national conferences. But as I said, these national conferences were somehow imposed by the IMF and the World Bank themselves. They said that, well, if you do not liberalize this system, well, we could not help you because you are in a debt crisis, etc. So this is a form of, they call it democratization, but it's political and economic liberalization. That means at the same time they were saying, now you have to vote, you could vote for many candidates, etc. There is no, single party rule. At the same time, you had this separation between the political sphere and the economic sphere. That means you could vote for whoever you want, but nothing will change on the economic side. This is the kind of democratization under US globalization. So that means that they should not repeat the same mistakes. We had and continue to have many crises in Africa, and every time it's the same liberal package, transitional government, etc., and you do new elections. And the ironic thing is that the transitional governments, generally, they are much more inclusive, less corrupt, and more representative. And once the transition is over, what you will have is, the same old system. I mean, the less compromise of the former system, they will be the candidates, and this will continue until the new crisis, and they will repeat it the same. So people should organize to draft themselves their own constitutions. I mean, working people, peasants, women organizations, etc. They should do their own constitutions, and that means that we have to contest the title to govern of so-called representatives, because that is the idea of democracy. Why should these people govern? We have to contest that. Are they more intelligent? Are they more, gifted to exercise power, etc.? What is the special title that makes them governance? We have to challenge that, because the idea of democracy is that each of us, we are qualified to deliberate for political good. But the thing is, when drafting this constitution, they should take into account economic issues, resource control, what kind of social content they would like the policies to deliver. If they do not do that, it will be the stalemate. And as I said, it is possible for all these countries to organize in a way that guarantees all the basic rights for their populations. They could do that. But simply doing that means that you won't be called a democratic country. That means that it's a declaration of war against the West and imperialism. That's the meaning. And generally speaking, also, there's this thing called kind of barricade effect. When you have a progressive government, everything that is done wrong will be amplified by the media. And also, most of the people we call progressive, they're also trying to take distance with these people. So that means that these new regimes, they might be legitimate, but they come through elections. Also, it is very rare. Or if they come through a military coup, they will be, marginalized even by the progressives. And so it's really an issue. That's why the only sustainable solution is for the people themselves to organize. I mean, why need a president? We just need people to implement what has been decided by the people. That's how I see things. We have tried too much, transition, and they have failed. So it's time for people to organize, but organizing in a way that will not separate economics from politics.
Thank you. And Benga, could you comment on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. I think my fellow panelists have actually addressed the salient issues here. I think it's actually problematic to pose the issue as democracy. Is it democracy or development that we want? Because I think really the two are not mutually exclusive. I think we need democracy to be able to achieve development, and vice versa. And it all depends on exactly what we define as democracy. Like Tunde said, and Sila also amply demonstrated, democracy shouldn't be about periodic elections, which is what the West has defined democracy for us to be. Democracy should be about the capacity of the governance process to actually deliver on the basic necessities of life. And the people do not demand for too much. All we want is to be able to have opportunities for decent employment, access to education for children, access to healthcare, access to potable water and sanitation. These are most basic, irreducible elements of development because that defines human development. And without human development, you are not even in the starting block of the development process. So if you have a system of periodic elections that cannot deliver on these most basic minimums, I dare say that that kind of process is absolutely useless. So I think it's too simplistic to pose it. Is it military coup or democracy? Because like Sila also demonstrated, you can have people, like we say in Nigeria, wearing agbada. Agbada is the preferred regalia of our local politicians, you know. So they can be wearing agbada ostensibly, democratically, in quotes, elected government, and yet they are as repressive, they are as corrupt, and perhaps even more corrupt than the military could ever be. And they could just be as subservient and perhaps even more subservient than any military government could ever be. So you have that kind of charade of a ruling elite dominating your political space, even though you may have in periodic elections that only qualifies to be democracy. In the Nigerian situation, for instance, we have seen a gradual erosion of whatever constitutes minimum democratic content of you know, our so-called civilian government since 1999, when we had the transition from military to so-called civilian government. Successive elections have seen the enthronement of a plutocratic order, a situation where you have to be a billionaire to be able to win election even to the parliament, not to talk of executive position like governor or the president. You have to have resources to be able to bribe police, to be able to be present in the media, and so on and so forth. So even when you have so-called progressive parties in the ballot, these parties can be in the ballot, but they're actually not in the ballot because nobody knows them, nobody get to hear them, because they can't even print posters, they can't afford the exorbitant political advertising, you know, that you have to invest in, and so on and so forth. So this, in my view, hardly qualified as democracy. If indeed democracy is a system that ensures that people are able to organize themselves on the aggregate of their own interests and are able to project politically their presence in the political space through that organized platforms. So we have civil rule without democracy. So what to do actually is to reconstruct the civic space, especially in Francophone Africa and also in other parts of Africa, especially Nigeria under so-called Anglophone countries. The civic space has been terribly eroded. We found under the military, it was clearer, it was more brazen, it was open. But under so-called these plutocratic civil rules, we've had a situation of gradual incorporation, you know, of leading trade unions, civil society organizations, corruption, and you know, destruction of the civic space. We have to rebuild the civic space. We have to give our people the most basic political education, like has been said earlier. We have to create popular structures, you know, that can occupy not only civic, but also even physical spaces that can help to project people's interests and to defend those interests. We believe that these are the minimum building blocks of genuine democracy that will be people-led and that will be people-focused, not a democracy that is oriented outwards, that is there only to please the whims and caprices of imperialism. That kind of democracy has not served us, and it's clear that it will never serve any useful purpose. One other point I wanted to really emphasize is that my fellow panelists keeps emphasizing no to militarism. We don't want military intervention in Niger. I am a little bit confident that we are not going to have military intervention in Niger, because I think our ruling, some people will say ruining elites, I think I've also come to realize that it's going to be an extremely costly exercise. But really, Niger is seriously, the Nigerian people are actually terribly embattled right now. There's a crippling sanctions on Niger that perhaps might even be worse than an outright military invasion, as initially threatened by ECOWAS. The border closures is imposing terrible hardships on millions of people that live on cross-border trade. Nigeria, across Nigeria, a lot of the Nigerian Sahelian states, Republic of Benin, we've seen pictures of hundreds of trucks loading from the Lome port, heading for Niger, stuck at the borders. Some of the goods, some mostly food products are already getting spoiled. And Burkina Faso, Mali, the same thing. So we think we owe it a duty to actually mount pressures as much as we can to call for the end of this blockade and sanctions so that people can resume their life. If the governments in our various countries cannot do anything to help common working people, they should not do anything to aggravate very dire socioeconomic situations. So I want to emphasize that we really need to wage serious campaigns for ECOWAS and AU to lift the sanctions on Niger Republic so that people can, go back to normal life. Of course, whatever diplomatic process they want to initiate to find some sort of political situation is welcome, but at least this one demand, I think we need to really emphasize. So we have our work cut out for us. Progressive forces across Africa and all over the world really need to help the situation of political organizing of our people and also political empowerment of popular social forces so that the trade union, the civil society organizations, and other progressive formations, so that these organizations can actually be able to occupy relevant political spaces and post the right kind of agenda, minimum socio-economic agenda that reflects the basic needs of most people in Africa for decent lives, for economic development, for social equity, so we need to be forces on the ground that can re-echo this agenda and can put that agenda in the front burner. So whether we are confronted with civilian pretenders or military pretenders, at least we'll be able to have a mass movement with a well-articulated agenda for economic and social independence, that will guarantee the minimums across the African region for development and genuine grassroots democracy.
Thank you, Benga. I mean, I think it's a really important intervention you brought in there about the sanctions issue, because, with these sanctions are economic warfare. In a way, the war already has begun on Niger. So it's important you mentioned that. I want to thank all of you for speaking on this issue of civilian rule and democracy, because it is kind of a confusing issue, a quite contentious issue when talking about the present situation. What I want to do now is go to an audience member who had their hand raised. Baba Aya, I'm going to allow you to talk and you can ask your question.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, good. I think this is a very important discussion, and I salute the DSA International Committee for coming up with this. I agree with Benga. It's unlikely to have a military intervention. Now, not that it's totally off the table, but it is unlikely. However, the sanctions are it's a war, it's an economic war, so to speak, and it's not just directed against the military dictatorship, it's affecting the people. And I think part of what we should be looking at in talking of organizing is how to build, solidarity in resisting this within working class people in the region and beyond. A good example is a day or two back now, you had Ghanaian truckers protesting and threatening to boycott moving stuff from Tema because of their members that are cut off in Niger. These are kind of things that are generalizable towards deepening a class solidarity on this. But excuse me, I'll try to be quick. But on the issue as a whole itself, I think there are some basics that, in my view, are important to serve as point of departure. I mean, the first being, with a method of totality, looking at each point, I think as revolutionary socialists, we should look at the big picture, including the overarching goal, and we should inform principles, then principles inform our politics, and our politics inform our strategy. Talking concretely here is that, I mean, if we're talking of socialism being the goal, essentially this amounts to, it's something that's, I mean, to borrow from the text that, look, the emancipation of working class people will be the task of the working class. Now, because reality takes several shapes, things like that, but this thread has to run through every aspect, even when strategic considerations require concessions, this should be quite clear. And I think this is how anti-imperialism is consistently anti-capitalist. And in that light, for me, one of the things that I think is important to take a stand against in principle is against coups. Yes, there's usually that we test each coup on a case by case, but it's not even only coups. Everything has to be brought under the rubric of dialectical analysis, every single existing phenomenon and event. But based on some principles, the issue of coups is not about having illusion in liberal democracy. It's about that, look, if socialism, if the emancipation of the working class people, is about the conquest of the battle for democracy, then the issue of agency is not unimportant. And that was what Che was talking about when he said, look, the people don't need liberators. I'm not looking for liberators. The people must be their own liberators. Yes, in concrete reality, at times, that is not the case, but we should not then we should not baptize exigencies in the holy waters of, yes, it is comme ci, comme ça. I think it's dangerous. And whilst I agree with Sila, yes, we might not really say talking about a return of coups, and I mean, I enjoyed the trend he came out with even well before the Nigerian coup. It is also important to know that unlike the situation in the 60s to the 80s, where across the tricontinent you had, military, it's mainly in Africa and across, and mainly Francophone Africa. And I also think that when we look at it, that yes, there were some progressive military juntas in that period, like Sankara, but for Sankara, you also had You had Babangida, Buhari, and Abacha in Nigeria. You had Afrifa and Achiampong in Ghana. Don't forget also people like Matthew Kereko came in through a military coup in Benin. Eyadema in Togo. Sergeant Doe in Liberia. How many of these were progressives? Even talking of the current ones, each coup has to be looked at on its own merit. Like, for example, the situation in Burkina, I think there are some commonalities but differences. What led to the coup in Niger? Essentially, it was that Tchiani, who had been the head of the presidential guard for a dozen years, a general, was about to be kicked out of it. And it's part of the differences between when you have coups by generals and coups by lower officers ranking. So, and that is also part of why we are talking of the what is it called now, the sanctions and the impact. Most members, top officials of this junta in Niger have sent their families to Dubai, to UAE. So the thing is that I think we should not just dismiss away that, look, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. I think it's much more complex like that. But for practical political reasons and also for pedagogical, purposes of building we should realize that, yes, the left is weak. That is part of why we're where we are now. But we don't get away from this by now baptizing exigencies as, what could be. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the time.
All right, thank you for the question. Let's start with Dr. Silla, and then we'll go to Benga, and then finally with Tunde to answer the question.
Okay, I thank my comrade Baba Aye for his very interesting feedback and inputs. What I would like just to say is that, well, progressive forces, obviously, they do not, plot to create coups. We just observe coups. These are not things that are planned. These are just observed. And now the thing is, how do you react to that? In the case of Francophone Africa, as I said, these are political systems, colonial political systems, where there is no room for progressive forces to come through power through normal elections. It happened that the progressive governments or government that had progressive ambitions came from the military. This is history, a legacy of history. This is not something that has been chosen. The other thing is that if the people are not really organized and there is a battle for liberation, generally the army has been the most organized force. Are they progressive or not? It depends on the situation. But the thing is, the terms of the battle are set by imperialism every time. And we should remind people that the first Black Republic, Haiti, did not come, became independent through a vote or people protest. There have been people protest, but there have been a war of independence. Some countries got their independence through a war. So as Mandela said, it's the oppressor who determines the terms of the struggle. So that means that for us, it's important that our people became much more organized in a way that we could have the type of, changes, the type of transition we want. But you have the inertia of history, and we have to take it into account.
Thank you. Go ahead, Benga.
Yeah, really, I think it's a very simple matter. Nobody wants military coup. Nobody wants the military, because the military has no business ordinarily in government. The military has no business in the civic space. Well, I still have said, when you have a situation that we have, that's the harming of the popular army of the civic space, the organization of working people, the trade unions, the civic organizations, the community organizations are either so weak or have been incorporated by the neo-colonial state, or are absolutely inexistent in an organized form. It will be merely mounting utopia to say that the military cannot intervene, as if the military is immune from the contradictions of society, as if the soldiers are not part of the realities that every other persons have to live through. There are coup and there are coup. And like I've always insisted, every coup has its own context. The coup in Niger cannot be compared with the Ibrahim Traore situation in Burkina Faso. The coup in Gabon cannot be compared with the other coup we've had in recent times across West Africa. It is clear that there is French hand in the coup in Gabon. We saw Gabon, we saw France, almost going hysterical over Niger, irrespective of whether the coup was led by a general or whoever. And the same France is grinning, from one side of the mouth to the other in Gabon over the coup that has happened there. So, which shows clearly the origins and the nature of the coup in both countries. So what we want to, as dialecticians that we claim to be, is to look critically at each situations, the configuration of class and social forces behind the coup, and how people are organized to respond to the coup, what the coupists are saying, the social origin of the coup, what their agenda is, what kind of forces, both local and international, are driving that agenda. These are some of the critical analysis we have to do. I think it's a bit lazy to just dismiss coup, because it's not about what we wish, it's about realities we have to confront. So now we're having this spate of coup. See, by accident, we're having them in the most backward parts of Africa, the most backward parts of humanity. You see, by accident that we're having the people in these various countries, coming out with in uproarious jubilation over the coup in Niger. Is it really about Chiani that people are celebrating, or some of the demands that are coming out? Not even, and some of the postures that the coupists are coming up with, not necessarily because they want to, but because the dynamics of the local situation dictate that they must come up with those postures, that the French should leave, that American military interests should evacuate from Niger. These are revolutionary demands, whether we like it or not. And these are demands we must support, even if we do not support, because it's coming from the Nigerian people. And the Nigerian people are coming out en masse to support those minimal demands. These are clearly anti-imperialist and anti-colonial demands that we must all support. The issue is, how do we move beyond that? If we kick out, if we succeed in kicking out France and America from Niger, then what? If Niger is able to take better control of its uranium and is able to get better price for uranium, how do we deal with the issue of redistribution? How do we ensure that what comes out of it better serves the interest of the Nigerian people and not a few generals and their civilian colleagues? So I think these are the issues. We have no illusions about coup. And the point has been made that this cannot be the first option of any genuine socialist democrat, but that coup are a present reality that we have to confront. How do we confront it? What problematic agenda are we bringing to bear, in the process that is unfolding? How are we dealing? How are we, negotiating the political space, even with the so-called coupists and so on and so forth? For me, these are the critical issues. And for genuine patriotic, progressive, socialist activists, I think the present challenge is, first of all, how to ensure that that blockade is lifted, because as far as I'm concerned, it has nothing to do with the coupists in Niger. It has everything to do with the suffering of the working people in Niger, and not only in Niger, in the surrounding countries that historically have to relate with Niger, have to trade with Niger, and have to mutually, engage in commercial activities that are mutually beneficial to people across the sub-region. And of course, to go beyond that, to raise the issue of the broader issues of how do we reconstruct the civic space? How do we build genuine working people, political parties? I saw in one of the questions, somebody said Bazoum party claimed to be socialist. If indeed Bazoum party was socialist, I cannot see Bazoum's socialist agenda. Before it was overthrown, I could not see Bazoum's efforts or attempts at socialist reconstruction of the Nigerian economy and social, social life. And if indeed it was socialist, how come that people are jubilating over his overthrow? So these are, because the truth also is that we have a coup where people come out to say, no, we don't want this coup. At least we had that in Nigeria in 1976. There was a coup against a General Muritala Mohammed. And students and people came out to say, no, we don't want this coup. So it is possible that people will reject a coup if you have a government, not necessarily socialist or whatever, that at least, push forward an agenda that serves the people. So for me, that's the bottom line. And that should be, it's not about what we wish, or, whether we like soldiers or we don't like them. It is about reality that we have to confront. It's a reality we have to respond to. It's a reality that we have to engage. So how we do it actually is what is of primary importance as far as I can see.
And Tunde, do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my fellow panelists kind of spoke to it, right? It's not dialectical to come out against all coups, right? Not all coups are staged for the same reasons, right? Throughout history, and especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, anti-colonial and pro-people movements have conducted coups of their own, of overthrowing oppressive and brutal dictatorships, and really securing material gains for the masses who had the colonial boot pressed on their necks, right? So, I mean, I know in the history of Africa, the majority of the coups have been reactionary, oftentimes orchestrated by the Portuguese, the French, the US, and other European powers. But again, we have to think dialectically, and it doesn't make sense to just blanketly label all coups as the problem, right? And I think in this particular situation, the coup was understandable because of the situation that the people were facing, of the repression, the decades of neocolonialism, and really the control over their society. And so the fact that the military is like one of the more organized forces in society kind of speaks to some of the dynamics that we're seeing. And just on this sanctions point, right? I spoke to sanctions in my initial remarks. Actually, BAP signed on to a declaration opposing sanctions along with 55 Pan-African organizations that were opposing the declaration opposed sanctions on Niger. It was authored in Burkina Faso by the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity. And I think folks should check that out. We definitely see sanctions as war because that's what they are, right? And they're causing a lot of sanctions. I even tried to speak to some of the effects of the sanctions during my remarks. So I think that's a critically important piece of this and something we have to fight against. But I think we should also recognize that the people of Niger and beyond are still rising up against French and U.S. military presence on their soil, right? And so that's something we have to see and recognize and fight against. So that I don't think it's right to ignore the military aspect of these things, and I don't think it's right to kind of cast off the threat of military intervention because it's present. So yeah, I just wanted to say that quickly.
I really appreciate that, Tunde, and I think this sort of is I guess a good place to wrap up. I guess one thing I want to ask you all in closing is just where do we go from here? The events are moving fast. When we started planning out this panel, this was pre the coup in Gabon, and as the situation continues to develop, how can people in DSA, but more broadly in America, in the Imperial Core, what can we do to concretely contribute? I'm really happy that we have two panelists coming directly from West Africa on the call. So I'd love for both of you to speak to that, as well as Tunde, as you are a member of one of the premier Pan-African organizations in the US. So yeah, really quickly, could you just sort of speak to that in maybe 2 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. So we'll start with Tunde first.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, what has been mentioned in terms of supporting the just aspirations of the masses and the people in the streets, right, and their anti-imperialist sentiments is key, right? And I think, there are a number of ways, we could take action. I'm sure that my fellow panelists will speak to some of those ways. I'll just mention briefly just a plug for the Black Lines for Peace and our month of action against AFRICOM. I think that is just a way to kind of spread the word and do some political education around, these issues of imperialism and neocolonialism in West Africa that are contributing to some of the conditions, right, in the Sahel. And so I think, folks should plug into that. There are chances to, a lot of resources to conduct teach-ins or just share information with, your organization, and then also to take action. And so I think that's just a way to educate, because a lot of folks here in the West don't know a whole lot about these issues. They don't know, they couldn't point to Niger or Mali, Burkina Faso, even Nigeria, right, on a map. So I think the first step has to be political education before you take action, in my opinion. But I think action absolutely has to be taken. And so, I definitely am interested to hear what the other panelists have to say, but I do want to plug that month of action against AFRICOM.
All right, Benga, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I want to say that I completely agree with Tunde. Yes, a lot of political education, a lot of political organizing. For me, the two both to go, together. We got to organize, we got to educate. These are vital ingredients of what I call a process of reconstruction of working people, popular basis of resistance against imperialism. If working people are not empowered with knowledge, working people are not organized around these critical issues, of course, we'll continue to have the ping pong between military and civilian representatives of imperialism. For me, it doesn't matter whether you're wearing khaki or whatever regalia you are wearing, whether you call yourself civilian or military. What matters to me is what interest do you serve and who do you actually represent? And as long as our people are not organized and sufficiently educated around these issues, we're going to have these problems. So that is very critical. I think one of the questions, issues around the international dimensions, the role of China and Russia in this. I want to say, because this has also been a point of serious agitation, even among progressive forces in Nigeria and elsewhere. For me, I don't think China and Russia are in Africa to help Africa, And I think it's a little bit simplistic and naive to put it that way. Russia and China has no business helping anybody except themselves. And so, but in relating with them, we also have to look at the dialectics of the situation. Russia right now is a country besieged by imperialism. Russia is fighting a war for its basic survival. So naturally, it's also looking for allies all over. And if in Africa, there's a little leverage you can gain by seeing how we can leverage on Russian military, perhaps economic support, to weigh against imperialism, I think it would be naive to just dismiss that. The same thing, China. A lot of time is said about Chinese interest in Africa and all of that, but it's also clear, what has come out very clear, is that when you have a responsible political elite that are ready to engage the Chinese, with knowledge and information, and are not just there for self-seeking interest of making some cheap money for themselves, then you can really actually achieve a lot of things with the Chinese. Because it's true that the Chinese have, more than the West has ever done, invested heavily in infrastructures across the African region and other parts of the world. You have a lot to gain by interfacing with Chinese capital, but from an enlightened position, from a position of enlightened self-interest, not the kind of bandits we're having in Africa right now. They go to China only to negotiate some cheap monies into their individual pockets. And so you use that now to blame the Chinese. I don't blame the Chinese. I blame the idiots that do that. So I think the thing is to be very dialectical, very practical about this in relating with these emerging powers and leveraging on potential support we can get from them. Because let's face it, we cannot realistically confront Western imperialism without any form of leverage internationally. That would simply be naive and impractical. But in relating with China and Russia, Russia is not necessarily socialist, not even in aspiration. And we know that while China claims to be socialist, there are elements, around their capitalist trajectory of development that could be dangerous. So that's why it's important to relate with these forces with our eyes wide open and from a position of enlightened self-interest to ensure that at least we're able to get the maximum possible for the upliftment of our people, and also to support and build progressive social forces to counter Western imperialist interest. For me, it's really as simple as that, outside merely making pious declarations that in reality and in practice not really, leave you nowhere. So these are the issues, for me. We have a job cut out for us: organizing and political education, and building popular basis of anti-imperialism across the continent, and of course, all over the struggling world.
All right, thank you, Banga. And finally, Dr. Silla.
Thank you. Just some quick points. The first is that in our struggles, we have to make people understand that the dominant idea of democracy is a blockage to our struggles, because as long as people think that it's just a matter of electing people every 5 years or 7 years, we'll not go far. And the thing is that, we observe that some elected government have been overthrown as well. This has to be analyzed in this context. Not that this is something desirable, but that these current systems, they will fit coups as long as they do not respond to people's demand. And the sad thing is that now Western countries realize that coups could be popular. So they could also back some military people to organize coup to prevent more radical change. We could see that, for example, in Gabon. So that means that there is a need for the people to understand that we need a more substantive concept of democracy than the one, created by neoliberalism. The second thing is that we have also to make sure that sanctions against Niger to be removed, because these sanctions are illegitimate and they make the Nigerian people suffer, and they have a neocolonial nature. Generally, people do not talk about that, because there's something called monetary sovereignty. monetary sovereignty means that there are limits to international sanctions. No Western government could divorce, for example, the Central Bank of Russia from the Russian government. Yet when you are in a monetary union, which has a colonial nature, the CFA franc zone, that is possible. There are some sanctions that have been made against Niger that are neocolonial because the Nigerian government could not have access to its own bound accounts. This is impossible for a government that issues its own currency. But when you don't issue your own currency, that is possible. And when people talk about sanctions, they did not talk about this aspect. And this is clearly illegal. There is no legal basis for these sanctions. When you look at the text of the monetary unions, the CFA franc monetary union in West Africa, there is no basis for these sanctions. But anytime a country has problems with France, France could activate its monetary weapon, to punish this country. They did it with Cote d'Ivoire 2019. They did it in Mali 2022. And now they are doing the same with Niger. These are neocolonial sanctions. So that means that African countries themselves should get rid of the CFA franc. And I think that there is a case for Saharan countries to unite together to have their own currency and to also try to pool their resources, military resources, and also have common, policies, industrial policies, and also regarding their resources. And that is important because Pan-Africanism should be the way. The Saharan countries themselves, they could not, address all of the challenges they have, climate challenge, development challenge, security challenges, etc. They need help, they need international solidarity. But given that international solidarity has been lacking, they have to, pool resources together, and that is Pan-Africanism, and they need that. And we have to help them in that endeavor. And yeah, that's, I think, what I wanted to say. Pan-Africanism should be the way, and we should help them so that ECOWAS and other countries remove these illegal sanctions, and they should seize this momentum to have much more, coordinated policies, much more political integration and economic integration.
Great, thank you. This is a great panel, and I appreciate all of the remarks of the panelists, and would love to continue working with you within DSA. Can we move to our resources slide, please? All right, thank you. So just a last few things before we conclude for today. At the top here, we have the link to our statement that we published on Niger. This is about a week ago that we published. After that, we actually have an article about the CFA franc zone written by our own Dr. Silla. Below that is a Black Alliance for Peace's statement on the situation in Niger. And then below that, Tricontinental put out a very good newsletter on the situation. So we would suggest reaching out or consulting all of these sources. And then finally, a way you can get engaged is by joining the DSA International Committee. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm Craig. My co-chair Matt is behind the scenes. We're the new leaders of the Middle East and Africa Subcommittee. So that's why we have the focus we did today. There's many other subcommittees for people to get engaged with as well. But we would really recommend that you join and get engaged with DSA. And then I think that's about it. Looking forward to hosting political education events like this throughout the rest of the year. Really excited to continue engaging with Africa. Africa's a priority to us. African workers and activists, trade unionists are a huge priority to us. So thank you for showing up and taking the time to learn from our guest here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.